rangers, forest workers, hunters, and other woods people of Reddit, what is your scary experience in the woods that you still can't explain? I've shared this story before. We have a camp that we visit during the hunting months and about every other weekend in between that. To get to our camp, you have to turn off of a major road onto a gravel road, drive about a mile, then turn onto another gravel road for about a half mile. It's set between a few other camps, plus some residents that live out there. It's quiet, for the most part. There are some coyotes and bobcats. Bobcats are the worst due to their terrible scream. It sounds like a woman crying for help. There has also been a black panther and wild dogs. 2013 we were at the camp for Thanksgiving. We hunted, fished, cooked, drank, all that good camp stuff. On night, we are sitting around a fire, swapping funny stories and just listening to the silence of the woods. As we are talking, we all hear, "Help me." At first, we thought it was a bobcat. We listened some more and heard it again. It was a man's voice yelling "help me" repeatedly. Now, our first instinct was to grab our guns. Second was to go towards the voice, but you never know what you will encounter in the woods. It was dark and cold. The hunters knew the area very well. We called the police and explained everything to the responding officers. The weird part was that we never once heard it while the officers were with us. Not once. The officers left and we heard the man again, repeating "help me." About half an hour later, the officers came back and we didn't hear any call for help. Again, silence. We all decided it was best to go inside our camp for the night. We never did find out anything. I've only been back to the camp once since then. Really freaked me out. I've lived in the Smokies most of my life. Anywhere I've lived in the Smokies, I've been completely surrounded by woods, naturally. One night at like 1 AM I was sitting on my porch drinking a beer. If you haven't lived out here, during the summertime, nature is loud. It isn't quiet. Cicadas humming, frogs belching, etc. It's like the ultimate white noise. While I was drinking my beer, I had noticed that everything in the woods had gone quiet. Which is pretty easy to notice when you live here because that doesn't happen. Suddenly, I heard the most terrifying noise I had ever heard about, I think maybe a good 30 or 40 meters away from me. It was a loud, shrieking, literally blood-curdling scream like shrill. It sounded non-human. It wasn't a mountain lion because I've heard them before, and they're rare in the area I lived. I stood up, audibly said nope, and walked the fuck inside. That was the one and only time that ever happened. I still live in the same house, and still drink the same beer on the same porch. We always built a tiki house in our woods, just some normal kids, and had loads of fun. But every week when we came back, it was destroyed and we were sad as hell, and always built a new one. One day we saw a guy in a black hoodie taking our sticks apart. We never came back. I've lived on the high desert for most of my life, 6,000 above sea level if you're wondering. I was out riding my horse alone in the absolute middle of bumfuck Egypt in the Badlands, no trees, and hardly any brush to speak of, so sounds carry a long way and there is nowhere to hide for long, when all of a sudden his ears perk up. I feel my skin start to crawl like we're being watched. My normally mellow gelding starts to panic. I start to feel really dizzy, and my horse stumbles. I black out. I come to an hour or so later about 3 miles away from the inciting incident still on my horse. He is frothing with sweat and shaking all over. I'm still not sure what happened. I had plenty of water and snacks. It was 65-ish degrees and breezy, so I don't believe weather or dehydration hunger were a factor. I have never before or after had a fainting spell, and that was the most reliable, quiet horse I've ever owned. I now have a serious case of the heebie-jeebies again just thinking about it. Friend and I were hiking in the woods. He was at the camp and I went to check on things about half a mile away. Suddenly, as if someone flipped a switch, the woods became silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just the most eerie silence I've experienced. After a few minutes, it suddenly went back to normal forest noises. Thinking I must have had a seizure or temporary deafness or something, I hurry back to camp, only to see friend standing there with a confused, scared look on his face. I must have had a similar look because he immediately asked if I heard the silence. We tried to come up with an explanation, but absolute silence in the woods seems impossible, even more so that it was so sudden. Not my story, but my younger sister's, early 20s. She was in Colorado last year and went hiking with her friend. The plan was to hike up the mountain, stop midway and camp, then finish the hike the next morning. They started their hike and stopped for camp midway. She said it started dumping rain that night, which meant the top would most likely be snow. The next morning they continued their hike, but it started getting complicated. Her friend only wore charcoal sandals and not proper hiking boots as they didn't expect the snow. They stopped at a creek and were deciding if they wanted to turn back on account they weren't prepared properly when they heard a faint "help me." They both stood still. They heard it again. They decided to follow up the creek to the woman's voice. They got to a clearing that was covered in snow and found a woman laying in it in basic athletic clothing, leggings, light pullover jacket, and athletic shoes. My sister said her legs were swollen, discolored and had nasty cuts on them. My sister asked her how long she had been out there and the woman said only a few hours. My sister was like, "Okay, we need to get you down this mountain." The woman was like, "No, I need to go up the mountain, that's where my car is parked." My sister was like, "No, there is no driving access at the top of the mountain," which was a sign that this woman was confused. They get her down the mountain and my sister just kept saying how confused this woman was. They get to the bottom and they find this woman's car. My sister couldn't get cell service to call 911 during this, by the way. Anyways, my sister tells this woman she's going to drive her to the hospital, but the woman is standing strong that she would just like to go back to her bed and breakfast. My sister takes her there while driving this woman's car. Once the woman is at the bed and breakfast, she thanks them and goes in. My sister spoke to the owners and was like, "You have to call a medic. She is severely confused and not acting normal." They call a medic and transport her to hospital. Turns out this woman is from Chicago, has low blood pressure, and it was her first time ever hiking a mountain. She was also alone. She had passed out during her hike, then it dumped snow on her. She was hypothermic and only thought she'd been out for a few hours. She was out overnight in the dark, cold and alone. I couldn't imagine the terror she must have felt. Anyways, my sister went and saw her at the hospital and the woman thanked her for saving her life. They still likely keep in touch. Backwoods hiking camping trip up in Maine. Trail intersected overgrown logging road. Checked topo map. Saw logging toad lead to isolated pond. Hiked to pond. Found small clearing. Perfect spot to camp. Went to bed shortly after sunset, 8:30 p.m.ish. Woke up around 1:30 a.m. to distant but loud noises coming from all angles around us. Up the logging road both directions, across the pond and in the woods. Deep bass Y groans and hoots, occasionally hitting higher pitched noted. Been in the woods for most of my adult life. Have come in contact with just about all the larger mammals of the Northeast and have never heard those noises before. Haven't heard them again either. Will never forget that sound. Not my story, but my dad's. When my dad was in his 20s, he was staying with my mom at a small cabin in the woods of Colorado. It was fairly remote. There was another cabin about a mile away and a campground maybe 3 miles down the valley. Late one afternoon, he was out fishing on a nearby river by himself. As the lights started fading, he decided to call it a day and head back to the cabin for dinner. As he was walking back through the woods, he got an eerie feeling that he was being watched, but he couldn't see anyone or anything. He kept walking back, and then suddenly he heard a stick break behind him. He stopped, looking back for the source of the sound, but still didn't see anything. He nervously kept walking back, a little quicker, and then heard another stick break, whirls around and still nothing. This happened like 3 or 4 times, but every time he stopped to listen and look, there was total silence and nothing else moving. By the time he finally made it back to the cabin, it was nearly dark. He never did find out what was following him, but whatever it was left him alone after that. His best guess was a mountain lion stalking him or something. I was driving from Tucson to Denver in the middle of the night. Got tired, was pulling off and crawling a sleeping bag in the desert far away from the 2-lane blacktop I was on, Highway 666 BTW. It's since been renamed because everybody was stealing the signs. Anyway, pull off the road, onto a dirt road and then a little further. Kind of hid the truck behind some vegetation and tossed down a sleeping bar and pad in the middle of pitch black Houston, New Mexico night. No one around, no light, nothing at all, visibility for miles. I'm completely fucking alone in pitch black nothing and getting wound down and my eyes are getting droopy. Then I hear it. It sounds goofy to say but it's the same Indian music you'd hear in old black and white westerns. Native music, voices and a drum. I literally think I'm dreaming and when it starts I'm fucking petrified because that noise just appearing out of nothing simply put ice in my veins. Relax a little and unfreeze, and try to be logical about what I'm hearing, which has no physical manifestation of its origin. So, thinking logically, now instead of pure panic, I could be on the reservation at this point. Perhaps it's coming from behind a previously unseen hill. I get up, look around. I don't see anything at all. It kind of comes and goes in volume. Doesn't seem to be coming from a direction. I have no clue. I looked for evidence and didn't find any. Crawled back in the bag because I'd been driving for hours, and they sang all night. Logic tells me it had to be a group of people I didn't see. But I looked, and there were no ancillary noises like talking or stopping or anything. Just that Indian drum. And the hi-ya. What was originally terrifying became calming and I ended up sleeping fantastically. Later learned that was a terrible stretch of road for very bad things to happen. It sort of lived up to its 666 moniker for X and bad shit occurring apparently.